They said no African leader would dare. They were wrong. With those words, the silence of a continent broke, not with violence, but with vision. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a name once whispered in the shadows of Burkina Faso's struggle, has become the sound of something greater, awakening. For too long, Africa's story was written by others, her data, her destiny, her dignity, sold in the name of progress. But now, one man stands where many feared to stand, saying with quiet fire, Africa will no longer be mapped by foreign hands. This is not just politics, it is prophecy. It is the moment when a generation raised on dependence begins to speak the language of sovereignty. And as the sun rises over Ouagadougou, one question burns brighter than all. Can Africa truly reclaim her digital soul? Because what began as news from Burkina Faso has become a call to the world. If you believe in Africa's right to write its own story, if you still believe that courage can rewrite history, then hit that subscribe button and stay with me. Today, we witness the fire of freedom reborn. It began in the stillness before dawn, 5 o'clock in the morning. Ouagadougou still slept, but power was already moving through its veins, silent, precise, unstoppable. Inside the command center, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before a flickering map. His words were few, but his gaze was fierce. Shut them all down. 17 companies, 5 nations, 1 morning, no leaks, no delays, only coordination and conviction. For months, Traoré had been tracing invisible lines, data routes buried under the name of development. What the world called partnership, he saw for what it was, occupation in disguise. Hidden behind every app, every biometric ID, every cloud service, lay a quiet extraction machine, siphoning Africa's digital lifeblood. They said it was progress. He called it plunder. When the order went out, Operation Clear Sight came alive. Servers seized, hard drives sealed, encrypted communications rerouted, exposed. In one single act, Burkina Faso interrupted an empire of algorithms. And as the evidence unfolded, so did the truth. Thousands of African citizens, monitored, mapped, monetized. Their voices recorded, their movements tracked, their finances traced. All under the banner of international cooperation. Traoré stood before his council that morning and said softly, "They took our gold. Then they took our oil. Now they take our data. But not anymore." The room fell silent. For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso was not being spoken for. It was speaking back. Western analysts would later call it reckless. Some said it would isolate the nation. But to many across Africa, it was revelation. A young soldier turning into a statesman, daring to confront a system no one else would name. Because what Traoré understood, and what the world forgot, is that data is destiny. Whoever controls it controls the mind, the market, and the memory of a people. As the sun rose over the capital, citizens woke to headlines that read, Burkina Faso shuts down foreign tech giants. But behind those headlines was something deeper, a rebirth of dignity. Mothers wept, students cheered, the internet trembled with one phrase repeated again and again, Africa is awake. This was more than a shutdown. It was a statement, a declaration that Africa's silence had ended. And yet, even as the world scrambled to respond, one question remained suspended in the air, sharp, electric, undeniable. If Africa can pull the plug on surveillance, can it also reconnect with its sovereignty? The morning after the shutdown, something extraordinary happened. Burkina Faso did not descend into chaos, it rose into clarity. From the crowded markets of Bobo Dioulasso to the quiet fields of Koudougou, people whispered one name, Traoré, not in fear, but in faith. Across Africa, radio hosts abandoned their scripts to speak freely for the first time. In Mali, a broadcaster said through tears, "He did what our leaders only dreamed of." In Ghana, university students gathered in courtyards, holding handwritten signs, Africa is not offline anymore. The rebellion was not waged with bullets, but with belief. It traveled faster than fiber optic cables, through heart, through hope, through history. For decades, Africa had been told that progress came with permission, that development required dependence, that digital partnerships were gifts, not chains. But when Traore pressed that single order, shut them down, the illusion shattered. In Nairobi, tech analysts began tracing suspicious data routes. In Guinea, ministers demanded audits of every foreign contract. And in Senegal, youth leaders marched through Dakar chanting, "Our data, our choice." The West watched in disbelief. How could a small nation ignite such a continental fire? Because, as one scholar put it, truth moves faster than control. And the truth was this: what had been sold to Africa as modernization was in truth a new map of manipulation, drawn not with borders, but with bandwidth. The reaction from abroad came swiftly. In Brussels, the European Union warned of anti-investment tendencies. In Washington, officials expressed concern over economic stability. But beneath the polished language lay a tremor of fear, the kind that comes when the powerless suddenly remember their power. Tech giants scrambled, emails leaked, executives met behind closed doors to assess the Traoré effect. For the first time, Africa was no longer being studied, it was being respected. But within the continent, the tone was different. It wasn't arrogance, it was awakening. From Accra to Addis Ababa, leaders began to see that sovereignty was not a slogan, it was strategy. And for ordinary Africans, it was something even greater: vindication. The feeling that after centuries of extraction, someone had finally said, enough. In the churches of Lagos, pastors invoked Traoré's name in prayer. In the mosques of Niamey, imams spoke of digital dignity. And in the homes of elders who had once marched for independence, there were tears. Because this, they said, felt like liberation again, not the liberation of land, but of identity. Not the cry of rebellion, but the hum of realization. Because Africa was beginning to understand that true freedom does not come from aid, or arms, or approval. It comes from autonomy. And autonomy begins with ownership of your land, your labor, and now your data. One Ghanaian activist summed it up in a single line that would echo across the continent. They mapped our minerals, our mines, and our memories. But now, we map ourselves. In that moment, the rebellion became a renaissance. The fire of outrage turned into the light of understanding. And across borders that once divided tribes, a new unity was born, not of blood, but of bandwidth. Africa was no longer a client, it was a creator, no longer a field to be mined, but a mind to be reckoned with. And yet, as the continent rose in digital defiance, one question began to burn through every newsroom, embassy, and boardroom alike. If Africa can unite in cyberspace, what will it dare to reclaim next? It began with a signature, 6 of them to be exact: Burkina Faso, Mali, Guinea, Niger, Senegal, Ghana. Not a military pact, not another trade bloc, but something far deeper, a declaration of digital independence. They called it the Continental Digital Sovereignty Framework. But to those who signed it, it was more than policy. It was redemption. For the first time since the Berlin Conference divided Africa on paper, a new document was being written. Not to divide the continent, but to unite its code. At the heart of the charter was a single revolutionary sentence: data of Africa must remain in Africa. Under this framework, every foreign technology firm operating on African soil must disclose its server locations, its encryption keys, its algorithmic ownership. No more secret pipelines of power disguised as partnerships. No more contracts that trade sovereignty for software. Violations would be fined $25 million, enforced by a supranational regulator headquartered in Bamako. What once seemed impossible, and Africa policing its own digital borders, had now become law. And as the ink dried, something sacred shifted. It was as though a continent, long silenced by contracts, had finally found its voice. But the world did not clap. In Tel Aviv, anger. In Paris, alarm. In Washington, disbelief. Editorials branded the new law as digital nationalism. Analysts warned of market isolation. But in the same breath, those same voices ignored the irony. Europe enforces its GDPR. America guards its data sovereignty. Yet when Africa does the same, it becomes defiance. Commentator from Accra put it best. When they protect their data, it's privacy. When we protect ours, it's rebellion. Still, Traoré's tone remained calm. This is not hatred, he told the press. It is principle. We will trade with anyone, but only as equals. In that moment, the world saw something it had not seen in Africa for generations. Discipline disguised as defiance. Tech investors panicked at first, but then something unexpected happened. As Israel-linked firms withdrew, new offers flooded in. From Asia, from Latin America, from nations that saw Africa not as a customer, but as a collaborator. India offered open-source partnerships. China pledged infrastructure under the motto, "Data stays where it's created." Even Silicon Valley began to whisper about the Traoré standard, a benchmark for ethical data use. In African universities, professors coined a term for this movement, digital Pan-Africanism. They taught their students that firewalls are the new front lines of freedom. Young coders began designing encryption in Swahili, in Yoruba, in Hausa, language meeting logic, heritage meeting hardware. And as these programs grew, so did pride. For the first time, African youth weren't dreaming of leaving. They were coding to stay. Yes, there were critics. Yes, there were challenges. But history had shifted. Because in a world obsessed with access, Africa had chosen accountability. The global narrative of dependence was collapsing. The new story, written by Africans, coded by Africans, owned by Africans, was only beginning. And as the world watched from afar, one question echoed like a prophecy through every ministry, newsroom, and marketplace alike. If Africa can write its own digital rulebook, can it also rewrite the rules of power itself? When the dust settled, the silence was almost holy. From Brussels to Beijing, from Washington to Windhoek, the world stared into a mirror and saw Africa staring back. For decades, the narrative had been simple. Africa follows, others lead. But now that script was being rewritten line by line, clause by clause, algorithm by algorithm. The headlines called it radical. The analysts called it risky. But beneath the language of caution was something new, respect. In London, think tanks coined a term they once feared to say aloud, digital decolonization. In universities from Nairobi to Cape Town, a new course appeared on the syllabus, Digital Sovereignty Studies. Students debated ethics, equity, and empire not in history books, but in real time, because they were living it. Even in Silicon Valley, whispers grew. A senior executive admitted privately, Traoré did what we only theorized. He put moral code above market code. Meanwhile, in mosques, churches, and open-air classrooms, the message spread like gospel. Freedom without firewalls is freedom that can be deleted. And the people listened, because this was not about wires or servers. It was about worth. Across Africa, elders spoke of a familiar rhythm returning, the rhythm of ownership, of knowing that the land beneath your feet, the thoughts in your mind, and the data in your devices belonged to you. That was the true rebellion, not against nations, but against neglect, not against the West, but against the weight of being unseen. Through the mirror of this moment, the world was forced to ask itself uncomfortable questions. If Africa could reclaim its data, what else might it reclaim? If the youngest continent could rewrite the rules of technology, what excuse would the rest of the world have for silence? And in that reflection, the old order began to crack. Because when one continent dares to dream with discipline, the others can no longer pretend they are awake. If Africa's reflection can shake the world, what happens when the world finally recognizes itself within her? From rebellion came rebuilding, from outrage came order, and from a single command in Ouagadougou came a continent learning to breathe on its own again. By mid-2025, the numbers began to speak. African tech startups compliant with sovereignty laws saw investments rise by 43%. Data centers once owned by foreign firms were now being rebuilt in Kigali, Nairobi, and Accra, with African hands, on African soil. For the first time, Burkina Faso was no longer exporting raw materials, it was exporting principles. Its name appeared not just in the pages of geopolitics, but in the hearts of a people who had rediscovered pride. Young engineers called it the new independence. Economists called it the Traore effect. But for the people, it felt like something older, like prophecy fulfilled. They had heard their ancestors say, freedom without control is illusion. Now, they were living proof that sovereignty could be coded, not just declared. The new Africa that was rising did not need permission to protect its dignity. It was building firewalls, not fences. It was defending rights, not regions. From Kenya came a voice. They once mapped our minerals, now we map our minds. From Ghana, a chant, our data, our choice, our destiny. From Burkina Faso, the quiet conviction of Captain Ibrahim Traoré. They took our gold, our labor, our silence. But our data, our soul, will not leave this land again. And the world could no longer look away. For centuries, Africa's strength was measured by what was taken from her. Now, her power was being defined by what she chose to keep. It was not revenge. It was restoration, not isolation, integration on equal terms. Because sovereignty is not selfishness, it is self-respect. And for the first time in the digital age, Africa had earned both. As the world recalibrated, investors began calling their new standard Africa compliant. But in truth, Africa had only complied with one thing, her own conscience. And as the continent looked forward, united not by chains, but by choice, one question burned brighter than before. If Africa can protect her data today, can she finally protect her destiny tomorrow? It was never about revenge. It was never about defiance for its own sake. From the very beginning, Captain Ibrahim Traoré's message was one of restoration, the restoration of dignity, of destiny, of digital faith. Today, when you read Ibrahim Traoré news, you are not reading a headline. You are witnessing a heartbeat, the rhythm of a continent rediscovering its worth. What began in Burkina Faso was not a rebellion, but a revelation. It was the sound of Africa saying, "We are not waiting to be saved. We are saving ourselves." For generations, the world taught Africa to borrow its future. But now, Africa is building it, line by line, code by code, truth by truth. That is not just Burkina Faso news. That is world news, divine in its courage, sacred in its intent. Traoré's words still echo through the continent. Freedom in the digital age is not given, it is coded. And with every line of that code, Africa is writing a gospel of sovereignty, a story that says power no longer comes from permission, but from purpose. The elders feel it, the youth live it, the world watches it. A continent, once mapped by others, now maps itself, not through borders, but through belief. When you next see Ibrahim Traoré news, remember this: you are not seeing a man rise. You are seeing a movement awaken. This is not the end of Africa's story. It is the beginning of its ownership. Because in this new world, where information is the oil and ideas are the currency, the real question is not who mines the data, but who defines the destiny. And to you watching, the believer, the dreamer, the witness, this story calls you too. If you believe in Africa's right to protect her digital soul, don't just scroll, stand. Comment below, share this message. Because freedom that is not spoken is freedom that fades. This is the dawn of a new declaration, not written on paper, but in code, not signed by hands, but sealed by conviction. Africa is awake. The world must adjust.